In the borderlands between history and myth, where memory dissolves into imagination and facts blur into folklore, there exists a figure who haunts the collective consciousness of Britain like no other. His name appears in exactly 2 medieval chronicle entries, separated by 21 years and written centuries after the events they purport to describe. One records a battle, the other records a death. Between these sparse mentions stretches an abyss of silence. No contemporary accounts, no physical evidence, no verifiable facts. And yet, from this void emerged the most enduring legendary monarch in Western civilization. We know almost nothing certain about Arthur Pendragon. What we possess instead is something stranger and perhaps more powerful. The accumulated weight of 9 centuries of storytelling, each generation adding its own meanings, its own needs, its own dreams to a figure who may never have existed at all. The transformation of Arthur, if there was an Arthur, from whatever he actually was into what he became, represents one of mythology's greatest magic tricks. A possible post-Roman warlord, perhaps a minor chieftain defending the remnants of Roman Britain against Saxon invaders, metamorphosed into the emperor of romance, the knight king of chivalry, the wounded monarch sleeping beneath the hill until Britain's darkest hour calls him forth again. This is not a story about finding the real Arthur, because that Arthur, if he ever drew breath, is irretrievably lost. This is a story about how legends are born, how they grow, how they serve the needs of societies that create them. This is about understanding why, in the gap between 2 chronicle entries and across 9 centuries of elaboration, a culture built not just a hero but an entire mythological universe, complete with magic swords, enchanted forests, doomed romances, and the greatest fellowship of warriors ever assembled. This is about the journey from warlord to legend, from the mist-shrouded battlefields of the 6th century to the pages of Geoffrey of Monmouth, from Welsh folklore to French romance, from historical footnote to eternal archetype. The first time Arthur's name appears in anything resembling a historical document is in the Historia Brittonum, attributed to the Welsh monk Nennius and written around 829 AD, roughly 300 years after Arthur supposedly lived. This is our earliest written source, and it's not a biography. It's not even particularly detailed. Arthur appears in a single paragraph, described not as a king but as a dux bellorum, a duke of battles, a war leader. The text claims he fought alongside the kings of the Britons, but was himself their military commander, winning 12 great battles against the Saxon invaders. The 12 battles listed in the Historia Brittonum read like a roll call of places mostly lost to time. Conflicts above the river Glyne, 4 encounters at the river Dubglas in the region of Linuis, a battle at the river Bassus, another in the forest of Celadon. At the 8th battle, the fortress of Ginion, something remarkable supposedly occurred. Arthur carried the image of the Holy Virgin Mary on his shoulders, and through her power, the pagans were routed. The culminating 12th battle took place at Mount Badon, where Nennius claims Arthur single-handedly slew 960 men in one charge. This number alone should signal that we've left the realm of historical accuracy and entered the domain of heroic exaggeration, the kind of legendary inflation that accretes around any figure who captures the popular imagination. The Annales Cambriae, the Welsh annals, compiled in the mid-10th century but drawing on earlier sources, provides 2 additional references. For the year dated around 516 AD, it records the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victors. That confusion about shoulders versus shield stems from a Welsh linguistic ambiguity. The words for shoulder and shield are nearly identical in Old Welsh. 21 years later, around 537 AD, comes the second and final mention, the strife of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell, and there was death in Britain and in Ireland. These are the entirety of our historical sources for Arthur before Geoffrey of Monmouth's revolution. 2 chronicle entries, a paragraph about 12 battles, that's it. No contemporary Roman accounts mention him, despite the supposed magnitude of his victories. The British monk Gildas, writing in the 6th century close to the actual events, describes the Battle of Badon in detail as a great British victory that temporarily halted Saxon expansion, but never names Arthur as its commander. He credits Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British leader, with organizing resistance against the Saxons. But Arthur goes unmentioned. This silence is deafening. But there's another Arthur, one who emerges from the shadows of early Welsh poetry and folklore, and he's far stranger than the military commander of the chronicles. In poems preserved in the Black Book of Carmarthen, one of the oldest Welsh manuscripts dating to around 1250, but containing much earlier material, Arthur appears as something otherworldly. The Stanzas of the Graves mentions his burial, but declares it a nuith, a marvel or wonder, suggesting Arthur's grave cannot be found. The first whisper of the once and future king, who never truly died. The most revealing pre-Geoffrey source is Culhwch and Olwen, a Welsh prose tale dated to around 1100, just before Geoffrey wrote, that presents Arthur not as a historical king, but as a folkloric figure leading a warband of heroes with supernatural abilities. This Arthur dwells at Chellywig in Cornwall, holding court like an otherworldly chieftain. When his cousin Culhwch arrives, seeking help to win the giant's daughter Olwen, Arthur assembles a company of warriors whose powers defy natural law. Say can hold his breath for 9 days and nights, grows as tall as the tallest tree, and generates heat intense enough to kindle fires in rain. Bedwyr wields a spear that wounds as effectively as 9 others. These aren't historical soldiers, they're the companions of a mythic hero. In Culhwch and Olwen, Arthur hunts supernatural boars, raids otherworld fortresses for magical treasures, and commands warriors who are clearly former pagan gods wearing thin Christian disguises. This Arthur exists in the liminal space between the human world and Annwn, the Welsh otherworld. He battles giant cats, divine boars, witches, and monsters. The tasks he undertakes to help Culhwch win Olwen require obtaining impossibly magical items, a basket that provides infinite food, the beard of a living giant, the blood of a witch. This is not the Arthur of history textbooks, but the Arthur of fairy tales and folklore, a figure of magic and wonder, operating by rules far removed from mundane reality. Here lies the crucial split in early Arthurian tradition. On one hand, the Historia Brittonum and Annales Cambriae present a quasi-historical military leader, albeit one already enhanced by legendary elements like single-handedly slaying nearly 1,000 enemies. On the other hand, Welsh folklore presents a supernatural champion leading a warband of heroes in quests against otherworldly threats. Some scholars suggest these represent different stages of Arthur's evolution, perhaps a historical kernel around which folklore accumulated. Others argue Arthur was always a mythic figure, possibly a Celtic god demoted to hero status after Christianization. We simply cannot know. What we do know is that by 1100 AD, when Geoffrey of Monmouth picked up his pen, Arthur existed in the cultural imagination as both military commander and magical folk hero. And Geoffrey would transform both versions into something unprecedented. Before we understand how Arthur became a king, we must understand what Pendragon actually means, because this title embodies the confusion between history and legend. The word comes from Middle Welsh, pen meaning head or chief, and draig meaning dragon. But draig carries deeper resonance than simply the mythical beast. In early Welsh usage, it also connoted warrior or leader, derived from the Latin draco, a military standard carried by Roman legions, decorated with a dragon-shaped windsock that would fill and ripple in the wind during battle, creating a fearsome spectacle. So, Pendragon translates literally as chief dragon or head dragon, but its deeper meaning is supreme commander, generalissimo, head of warriors. It was a title, not a family name, similar to Caesar or Pharaoh, denoting military supremacy rather than bloodline. In the earliest Welsh sources, Pendragon appears as an epithet of authority, a designation of leadership that would have been immediately understood as signifying the highest military commander. the warlord to whom all other chieftains deferred. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth's later elaboration, part of his vast historical fiction, Uther earned this title through a dramatic celestial event. When Uther's brother Ambrosius lay dying, a comet appeared in the night sky, its tail shaped like a dragon's head spitting fire. The wizard Merlin interpreted this omen. The dragon represented Uther, prophesying he would become king and father a son who would rule over all Britain. After Ambrosius's death and Uther's ascension, he adopted Pendragon as his epithet and had 2 golden dragons crafted, one as his personal standard, another for the cathedral at Winchester. Thus, Uther Pendragon emerged, Uther the dragon chief, Uther the supreme commander. The historical reality was almost certainly simpler. If Uther existed at all, and most historians doubt it, he would have been a post-Roman British warlord, perhaps one who united various Celtic tribes against Saxon invasion. The dragon standard itself was a real thing, inherited from Roman military tradition, later becoming a symbol of Wales itself. The red dragon still flies on the Welsh flag today. A British warlord of the late 5th century, leading combined forces against foreign invaders, might well have adopted the Roman Draco as his military standard and earned the title Pendragon for his leadership. The confusion began when later medieval writers treated Pendragon as a family name, creating the House of Pendragon and giving Arthur the surname Pendragon, as if it were hereditary. This misunderstanding persists in popular culture, where Arthur is often called Arthur Pendragon, as though that were his full name. But titles don't work that way. Uther was Pendragon. The title died with him, or passed to the next supreme military leader. Arthur, in the early sources where he appears as a military commander, might himself have been called Pendragon, not because of inheritance, but because he held that supreme military position. The dragon imagery carries another layer of meaning crucial to understanding Arthur's later symbolic resonance. In Welsh tradition and prophecy, the red dragon represented the Britons themselves, locked in eternal struggle with the white dragon of the Saxons, a battle prophesied to last until the red dragon finally triumphed and drove the invaders from Britain. This prophecy, attributed to Merlin in Geoffrey's work, but drawing on much older Welsh tradition, positioned Arthur not just as a king but as the fulfillment of prophecy, the dragon champion who would restore Britain to its rightful rulers. When Edward I of England later sought to suppress Welsh rebellion, he understood the power of this symbol and deliberately promoted the story that Arthur was definitively dead and buried, attempting to kill the prophecy that the Pendragon would return when Britain needed him most. Everything changed in approximately 1138 when Geoffrey of Monmouth, a Welsh cleric working in Oxford, completed his Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain. What Geoffrey created was not history, but revolutionary historical fiction disguised as chronicle, and its impact on Western literature and culture cannot be overstated. In a single work, Geoffrey transformed Arthur from a shadowy military commander and folkloric hero into the magnificent king of medieval romance, complete with imperial conquests, tragic betrayal, and the sword pulled from stone. Geoffrey claimed his account derived from a certain very ancient book in the British language, given to him by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. This book has never been found, never been verified, and most scholars conclude it never existed. Geoffrey drew on the Historia Brittonum, the Annales Cambriae, Welsh folklore, and his own considerable imagination to craft a comprehensive narrative of British history, from its supposed founding by Brutus of Troy down to the Saxon conquest. At its heart stood Arthur, now styled as High King of Britain, whose reign represented the apex of British glory before the tragic fall. Geoffrey's Arthur is born through magical deception at Tintagel Castle. His father, Uther Pendragon, consumed with passion for Igraine, the wife of his enemy the Duke of Cornwall, enlists Merlin's sorcery. Merlin transforms Uther's appearance to perfectly mirror the Duke's, allowing Uther to enter Tintagel and sleep with Igraine while her husband is away at war. That very night, the real Duke falls in battle. Arthur is conceived in this moment of magic, deception, and death. a conception that will haunt his reign, because a kingdom founded on treachery carries the seeds of its own destruction. When Uther dies, 15-year-old Arthur proves his legitimacy by accomplishing what no other man in Britain can: drawing a sword from a stone, or, in some versions, from an anvil atop the stone. This test, ordained by Merlin, demonstrates that Arthur is the rightful king chosen by destiny itself. He then receives Excalibur, though Geoffrey calls it Caliburn, either from the stone or later from the Lady of the Lake, depending on which version you read. The magical sword, forged in Avalon, becomes the symbol of his rightful sovereignty. Geoffrey's Arthur doesn't simply defend Britain. He conquers it, then expands his empire across the known world. He defeats the Picts and Scots, subdues Ireland, conquers Norway, Denmark, and Gaul. He establishes a glittering court at Caerleon, where he creates the Fellowship of the Round Table, though Geoffrey doesn't detail this institution. Later romancers would elaborate it. He marries Guinevere, described as the most beautiful woman in Britain, of Roman descent. He fights giants, establishes laws, and presides over a golden age of chivalry and prosperity. But Geoffrey also introduces the seeds of Arthur's destruction. While Arthur campaigns in Gaul, planning to march on Rome itself, word reaches him that his nephew Mordred has seized the throne and taken Queen Guinevere as his wife. Arthur rushes back to Britain, and at the Battle of Camlan in Cornwall, nephew and uncle face each other in the catastrophic final battle. Mordred falls, along with most of Arthur's greatest warriors. Arthur himself is mortally wounded, but not killed. He's borne away to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds, and here Geoffrey creates the most haunting ambiguity. Arthur neither lives nor dies, but waits in Avalon, existing in a state between life and death, until Britain's hour of greatest need calls him back. Geoffrey's genius was understanding what his post-Norman conquest audience craved. The Norman aristocracy wanted a grand, mythic history to rival Charlemagne and Rome, a legendary past that legitimized their rule over Britain. The Celtic Britons wanted a champion who proved their ancient glory and promised future restoration. Geoffrey gave both audiences what they needed, and Arthur, who was both imperial conqueror, satisfying Norman ambitions, and wounded king, prophesied to return, satisfying Celtic hopes. He welded together the battle leader of the chronicles, the supernatural hero of Welsh folklore, and his own inventions into a figure of such narrative power that he immediately captured the imagination of medieval Europe. What Geoffrey created was not history. It was mythology, but mythology of the most sophisticated kind, deeply rooted in genuine historical anxieties, cultural memories, and political needs. He took the fragments, the glimpses, the shadows of early tradition and built from them a cathedral of story. The transformation of Arthur didn't stop with Geoffrey. His Historia Regum Britannia became a medieval bestseller, copied and recopied, translated from Latin into French and English and Welsh. But in spreading across Europe, Arthur also mutated, each culture and generation reshaping him according to its own needs and values. The French romancers of the 12th and 13th centuries seized Arthur's court as the perfect backdrop for exploring courtly love, chivalric virtue, and spiritual questing. Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the 1170s and 1180s, created the 5 romances that would define Arthurian literature: Eric and Enide, Cleges, Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Yvain, the Knight of the Lion, and Percival, the story of the Grail. In Chrétien's hands, Arthur himself recedes somewhat into the background, becoming the presiding monarch whose court serves as the launchpad for his knight's adventures. It's in Chrétien that we first encounter Lancelot, who appears nowhere in the early Welsh sources, as the greatest knight who ever lived, utterly devoted to Arthur, yet hopelessly in love with Queen Guinevere. This adulterous love triangle, nowhere present in Geoffrey, became the tragic heart of later Arthurian tradition. Lancelot's perfection as a knight is matched only by his fatal flaw: his love for his king's wife. Guinevere, transformed from Geoffrey's brief mention into a fully realized character, becomes the beautiful queen whose love ruins the greatest knight and tears apart the fellowship. The French romances elaborate this tragedy across vast story cycles, showing how the perfection of the Round Table contained within itself the seeds of destruction, how loyalty and love could conflict impossibly, how even the best intentions led to ruin. The Grail quest enters Arthurian tradition through these French romances, particularly the Vulgate cycle of the early 13th century. The Holy Grail, identified as the cup Christ used at the Last Supper, or the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, appears as the ultimate object of spiritual seeking. Only the purest knight can achieve it, and that knight is Galahad, Lancelot's son, whose purity redeems his father's sin. The Grail quest transforms Arthur's court from merely the greatest fellowship of warriors into a spiritual community seeking divine mysteries, though the quest ultimately fails because the knights are corrupted by worldly attachments. Most of them die seeking the Grail, and those who survive return to a Round Table already fracturing from internal corruption. But Arthur wasn't just becoming more European, he was also becoming explicitly English, despite his Welsh origins. This transformation reached its apex when King Edward I of England, in his brutal campaigns to conquer Wales between 1277 and 1283, deliberately appropriated Arthur as an English symbol to undermine Welsh resistance. The Welsh prophecies held that Arthur would return to drive out the Saxon invaders and restore Britain to Celtic rule. Edward understood the dangerous power of this prophecy during his attempted conquest. In 1278, Edward made a public visit to Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, where monks had conveniently discovered Arthur's tomb 99 years earlier in 1191. The monks claimed to have unearthed two bodies, Arthur's and Guinevere's, in a hollowed oak trunk deep beneath the abbey grounds. A lead cross, supposedly buried with them, identified the bodies. Edward ordered the tomb opened in his presence, then had the remains reburied with great ceremony in a magnificent marble tomb before the high altar. The message was clear: Arthur was definitively dead, properly buried on English soil, not sleeping beneath a Welsh hill waiting to return. The prophecy was dead. Welsh hopes should die with it. This political appropriation transformed Arthur's cultural identity. By the time Sir Thomas Malory wrote Le Morte d'Arthur in the 1470s, Arthur had been almost completely anglicized despite his Celtic origins. Malory's massive prose romance, written in English while Malory was imprisoned, synthesized the vast sprawl of French Arthurian romance into a single coherent narrative that would become the standard version of the legend. Here, we find all the elements we now consider canonical: the sword in the stone, the Round Table fellowship in its full glory, Lancelot and Guinevere's tragic love, Mordred as Arthur's incestuously conceived son, not just nephew, the quest for the Grail, the final catastrophe at Camlan, Arthur's passing to Avalon in a boat attended by mysterious queens. Malory's Arthur is the medieval ideal of kingship: powerful, just, generous, merciful, the perfect Christian monarch presiding over the perfect Christian court. But Malory also emphasizes the tragedy, the way perfection contains the seeds of its own destruction. The fellowship breaks apart from within. Lancelot's love for Guinevere, Mordred's treachery, the knights' worldly attachments preventing them from achieving the Grail. The Golden Age was doomed from its inception, built on betrayals and secrets that would eventually destroy everything Arthur created. Arthur endures not merely because of his adventures, but because of what he represents, and the central tragedy that gives his legend philosophical weight. On the surface, Arthurian romance offers everything popular storytelling should: magic swords, impossible quests, mighty warriors, tragic love, supernatural challenges. But underneath runs something deeper: a meditation on power, legitimacy, loyalty, betrayal, and the inevitable corruption of even the best intentions. The Round Table itself embodies this deeper meaning. Unlike a rectangular table with a head and foot signifying hierarchy, a circle creates equality. Every seat is equally prestigious, every knight equally honored. The fellowship Arthur creates is theoretically democratic, a brotherhood of equals united in common purpose. This innovation represents a radical political ideal for the medieval period, when hierarchies were considered divinely ordained. Arthur's court offers a glimpse of what governance by consensus and mutual respect might achieve: justice, order, protection for the weak, glory for the worthy. But the Round Table also demonstrates why such idealism fails. Equality breeds rivalry. If all are equal, every slight becomes unbearable. Every perceived slight to honor demands satisfaction. The knights, supposedly brothers, compete jealously for glory. They undertake quests primarily to outshine each other. Gawain, Lancelot, Percival, Galahad, each seeks to be recognized as the greatest, the most worthy. The very equality Arthur created turns into competition that undermines fellowship. The tragedy deepens through Lancelot and Guinevere. Lancelot embodies the knightly ideal completely: brave, skilled, courteous, generous, devoted to his king. His love for Guinevere should represent courtly love at its finest, ennobling, pure, inspiring him to greater deeds. And in one sense it does. Lancelot performs miracles of valor inspired by his love. But that same love is also betrayal, adultery, the violation of Arthur's trust and marriage. The very thing that makes Lancelot the greatest knight, his capacity for absolute devotion, becomes the weapon that destroys the Round Table. Arthur himself embodies another layer of tragedy. His conception was the product of magical deception and adultery. Uther sleeping with another man's wife through Merlin's trickery. This original sin haunts Arthur's reign. In most versions, Arthur unknowingly commits incest with his half-sister Morgause, or Morgan Le Fay, producing Mordred, who will eventually kill him. The son born from Arthur's sin becomes his nemesis. It's profoundly mythological. The king's hidden flaw, the crime he doesn't even know he's committing, produces the instrument of his destruction decades later. The Grail quest represents the spiritual dimension of this tragedy. The Grail appears as a challenge to the Round Table. Can you transcend worldly concerns and achieve spiritual perfection? The answer is no. Only Galahad, born pure and remaining pure, achieves the Grail, and he immediately dies or ascends to heaven. He cannot exist in the earthly world. The other knights fail because they're attached to worldly things: glory, love, pride, revenge. Even Lancelot, who comes closest after Galahad, fails ultimately because of his love for Guinevere. The quest reveals that Arthur's court, for all its glory, remains fundamentally worldly, incapable of transcendence. The wounded king archetype appears across Indo-European mythology. The Fisher King, pierced by a spear, whose wound will not heal and whose land becomes waste because of it. Arthur becomes a version of this figure, wounded at Camlan, neither alive nor dead, suspended between worlds. His wound represents Britain's wound. His inability to die or fully live mirrors the nation's inability to heal from the catastrophe of the Saxon conquest. The prophecy that he will return when Britain needs him most offers hope that the wound can eventually heal, that restoration is possible, but only after a long period of suffering and waiting. What makes Arthur powerful as mythology is this darkness at his core. He's not a simple hero. He's a tragic figure whose best qualities contribute to his downfall. The court he creates is glorious but doomed. The fellowship he builds tears itself apart from within. The love that inspires greatness also betrays and destroys. Arthur represents not triumph, but the tragedy of noble failure, the poignancy of aspiration that outreaches possibility. This resonates because it reflects genuine human experience. We build things, relationships, communities, institutions, with the best intentions, only to watch them decay or explode from internal contradictions. We create codes of honor that become prisons. We love people whose love for us is not enough to prevent betrayal. We lead well and are destroyed by those we trust. Arthur's story tells us that, even in failure, there is nobility. Even in tragedy, there is glory. And perhaps most importantly, that failure and tragedy don't erase meaning. They deepen it. So we return to where we began: 2 chronicle entries, a paragraph about 12 battles, and 900 years of accretion. Arthur Pendragon, if he existed, was probably a Romano-British military commander or Celtic chieftain who led resistance against Saxon invasion around the turn of the 6th century. He may have won an important battle at Badon that temporarily halted Saxon expansion. He may have died at Camlan in a battle against other Britons. Medrawd, who may or may not have been his nephew, perhaps led a rival British faction. He was probably not a king but a war leader, a dux bellorum, a man who held power through military prowess rather than royal bloodline. Or perhaps he never existed at all. Perhaps Arthur was a title, not a name, a designation of leadership that various men held at different times, their separate exploits conflated into a single legendary figure. Perhaps he was Ambrosius Aurelianus, the Romano-British leader Gildas actually credits, his name Latinized and his deeds transferred to the more memorable Arthur. Perhaps he was a minor chieftain whose name survived in local folklore and oral tradition, onto whom later generations projected their own meanings and needs. We will never know. The historical Arthur, if he existed, is lost beyond recovery. What survives is something far more interesting. The Arthur that Britain and later Europe needed him to be. The Welsh needed a hero who embodied resistance against invasion, a champion prophesied to return and restore their nation. The Normans needed a legendary king to legitimate their rule, an imperial Arthur to rival Charlemagne. The French romancers needed a court where courtly love and chivalric virtue could play out their dramas. The English needed a national myth hero distinct from continental traditions. Medieval Christianity needed the Grail quest to dramatize spiritual seeking. Each age remade Arthur in its own image. Modern retellings continue this tradition. T.H. White's The Once and Future King transforms Arthur into a commentary on war and pacifism, written against the backdrop of World War II. Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon retells the legend from the perspective of the women, examining patriarchy and the suppression of pagan spirituality. Mary Stewart's The Crystal Cave series grounds Arthur in a more historically plausible Dark Age Britain. Bernard Cornwell's Warlord Chronicles strip away the medieval trappings to imagine Arthur as he might actually have been, a brutal, pragmatic, Romano-British warlord, holding back chaos through force and cunning. Each version reflects its creator's concerns and its era's anxieties. This is mythology's true power. Not that it preserves historical truth, but that it provides frameworks for understanding our own experiences. Arthur's story offers us archetypes of loyalty and betrayal, nobility and corruption, aspiration and failure. It gives us language for talking about leadership, fellowship, love, honor, and the tragic distance between ideals and reality. It provides the consolation that even doomed efforts at goodness and justice matter, that there is glory in noble failure, that a fellowship created in hope and destroyed by human weakness still represented something worth creating. The sleeping king under the hill, wounded but not dead, waiting to return when Britain faces its darkest hour. This image captures something essential about human hope. It says that the golden age we remember or imagine is not simply lost but suspended, that restoration is always possible, that the hero will return. Every nation, every culture has some version of this myth: the sleeping emperor, the hidden imam, the king who will come again. We need to believe that past glory can be recovered, that present suffering is not final, that the future might fulfill what the past promised but failed to achieve. Arthur Pendragon endures because we need him to endure. We need stories about leaders who try to create justice even when they know the attempt is doomed. We need tales of fellowship that tears itself apart but was glorious while it lasted. We need the tragedy of Lancelot and Guinevere to help us understand how love and loyalty can conflict impossibly. We need Mordred to embody how our sins, known or unknown, eventually return to destroy us. We need the Grail quest to dramatize the spiritual searching that transcends mere worldly success. And we need the wounded king sleeping under the hill, waiting to return, because we need to believe that restoration is always possible, that the end is not yet written, that the story continues beyond whatever immediate catastrophe we face. Arthur exists in the space between history and legend, between what was and what we wish had been, between the darkness of the Dark Ages and the light we imagine might have briefly shone there. He is simultaneously the warlord who might have fought at Baden and the emperor who never existed, the Welsh folk hero hunting supernatural boars, and the French romance king presiding over courtly love, the sleeping king who will return, and the dead king whose tomb Edward I displayed. All these Arthurs are real because all of them are necessary. All of them are fiction because none can be verified. All of them are true because truth in mythology is not about facts, but about meaning. The two chronicle entries remain: Battle of Baden, 516 AD, Strife of Camlan, 537 AD. Between those dates, everything else is mystery and invention, but what was invented has outlasted whatever might have been real, because what we imagine survives longer than what merely happened. Arthur Pendragon, warlord, king, hero, symbol, rides on through century after century, perpetually dying at Camlan, and perpetually being borne away to Avalon, neither alive nor dead, waiting to return when the world needs him. And that waiting, that space of possibility between death and return, might be where he is most powerful. If you found this journey through the mists of history and legend compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to History Scrolls TV for more deep dives into the mythological figures who shaped our cultural imagination. The story of Arthur is far from over. It continues evolving every time someone retells it, reinterprets it, reimagines it, and in that sense, perhaps the prophecy is true after all. Arthur does return, again and again, in every generation that needs him.